All right, well, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming today for our panel. Title of the panel is, let me remember, Lessons of Europe's Net Zero Policy Failures. I'm Brent Bennett. I am the Policy Director for the Life Powered Initiative here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Our mission at Life Powered is to raise America's energy IQ. But today we're going to talk a little bit about global issues, and particularly Europe. And we've got two of the best people in the world to talk about that with us today. To my left here is Benny Peiser. He's the director of the Global Warming Policy Foundation, which is the leading climate and energy think tank in Europe and one of the leading ones around the world, based in London. So Benny came all the way to London to do a tour of here in Washington, New York. So we're really blessed that he decided to come to Austin as part of his trip. The GWPF it was founded by the late Lord Lawson, who's Britain's former chancellor, served in the cabinet of Margaret Thatcher. And it's how long have you been around now? For 15 years? Yeah. And as I said, Benny's been doing this for a lot longer than me. He's written extensively on international climate policy and particularly Europe and the UK. So get your questions ready for what's been going on there. To his left is Francis Menton. Francis is the president of the American Friends of the Global Warming Policy Foundation. He's a retired attorney and was a partner at Wilkie, Farr and Gallagher in New York for more than 30 years. He still resides in New York, and he has a blog called the Manhattan Contrarian, where he writes about elite political ideologies on climate change, the purpose of government, New York policy, and also basic economics. And Francis can not only talk a lot of, add to a flavor of what Benny's going to talk about with Europe, but it can also talk about some of the crazy stuff that's where, particularly the Northeast states are trying to copy European policies to their great detriment. So really appreciate y'all showing up here today, and also for everyone online. So I'll get started with a few questions that I have for them, and then we'll move into audience Q&A later in the program. So Benny, I guess just to start, give us a summary of what the GWPF does and kind of the state of play for energy policy and our kind of sister organizations in Europe. And just a little bit about maybe the history of GWPF and also kind of what you're doing currently.
Right. So, as you said, the Global Warming Policy Foundation was set up. I turn it on. Can you? Oh, okay. So, the Global Warming Policy Foundation was set up 15 years ago by Lord Lawson and myself, and our main focus has been on the policy. That's what the name says, more so than on the science. We've been concerned ever since we launched about the kind of economic implications of certain policies, the social implications, and let's say for the first 13 years of our existence, no one really wanted to hear about the economic, industrial, social costs of all the policies being adopted in the UK and in Europe. And only in the last 24 months has there been a real sea change in public opinion, mainly because of the clear material evidence that people are hidden, the pockets about these policies, concerns about banning conventional cars, banning conventional gas heating in homes. So there has been a huge change, and for the first time, people are much more concerned about the policy implications, the cost of net zero than the climate issue. And that has led to we'll talk about that in a minute, the kind of results of the European elections, which have clearly shown a significant shift in the priorities of people have on these issues.
Yeah, let's just get straight into that, because that's one of the reasons we have the panel at this time. Is they had the elections for the European Parliament occurred last week, and there was quite a rebuke of what in Europe is a pretty bipartisan consensus on net zero. Even the center-right parties in Europe have embraced net zero, and a lot of the policies that flow from that ideology. And the elections last week were, as we kind of expected, because we've been seeing this brewing for a while, a pretty sharp rebuke of this across the board consensus on net zero. And so yeah, just kind of do you think what's happening is really, I mean, some policies are being reversed. Do you see a true reversal that is taking place, a realignment, or is this more just of a slowing down that we might reaccelerate again if energy prices go back down?
The kind of results of the European election are a clear indication of where the European public is moving. It's moving quite decisively more to the right. The biggest loser in the elections were the Green parties, who hemorrhaged voters significantly and are a much diminished force now. The green agenda, or the Green Deal or net zero, did play a role in the elections. The farmers had demonstrations for months in Brussels. The big change that I envisage, I mean, by and large, the kind of mainstream parties will continue with the Green Deal. By and large, I cannot see this being dismantled anytime soon, because the mainstream parties, including the mainstream conservative parties, will stick to the general gist of net zero. However, there is one policy which might be dismantled, and that is the ban of conventional cars, which the EU decided should be, the sale of conventional cars should be banned by 2035. There seems to be among the, at least Italian and German conservative parties, a very strong, and not just the Germans, Italian, but in general, they are beginning to realize that there's a risk of destroying European car industry for good if they stick to this ban. And there is a clear indication by the mainstream conservatives to say they want to get rid of that ban. We'll have to wait and see because of the complexities of European policymaking. But I think this would essentially signal a dramatic reversal of net zero policies if that were to happen.
Yeah, so that's a good point, because just as Europe is, again, we can kind of forecast in the U.S., as Europe is starting to back away from its policies to, ban gas-powered vehicles, the current administration in the U.S. is advancing in that regard. And I think that what's going to happen here is that eventually those costs, a little too loud there. Eventually those costs as those costs start to show, as it really, and that's what we've been trying to point out a lot, is that the cost of these policies of the fuel economy regulations already exist. They're just very hidden. As that starts to show, then these policies are going to start to be rolled back or reversed, particularly with vehicles. Francis, I just wanted to ask you a little bit about what you think, having observed what's happened in Europe, what do you think is going to be the implications of that for both our election coming up in November, and also the policy landscape flowing from that, regardless of who wins the election next year? You could go both. You could say, whether Biden wins or Trump wins, what do you think is going to kind of be the policy implications, having seen what's happened in Europe?
My first comment on that, and can you hear me okay? Yes. My first comment on that is that I don't think there's any particular reasoning that's gone into the green policies that we have. So the advocates, I don't think, can be reasoned out of it. They didn't come to where they are by logic. They came to it by zealotry or religious devotion, and they can't be reasoned out of it. In the Biden administration, the people who are making the regulations, I think, are committed, devoted advocates of the green policies, and I don't think they are going to back off. I think if Biden is reelected, they're going to stay where they are. I think some of the regulations that have just come down, particularly the power plant regulation, is highly likely to go down in the courts. And if Trump is elected, I think he is going to reverse the new power plant regulations, the new car mileage regulations that just came out a few days ago, as quickly as possible. It's not that fast a process, but it can be done in 4 years, certainly. I think he's going to focus much more on it this time than he did last time. That's at the federal level. At the state level, well, we have red states and blue states. I live in New York. New York is the most far off the deep end of a radical climate policy of any state. They're trying to show California who's boss here by taking whatever California does and going them one better. So New York has actually now adopted a suite of regulations with fixed deadlines that kick in by 2030 that are completely inconsistent. We're going to close the power plants that work. We're going to put electric vehicle mandates. We're going to put electric heat mandates with no idea where the electricity is coming from. And they are not going to back off that politically. So New York is driving a truck into a wall. And the question is it actually going to hit, or what's going to break first? I think it's going to hit the wall in New York sometime between now and 2030.
Yeah, so your prediction for not just New York, but for many of these blue states that are starting to set firm deadlines, and this is kind of what I see in Europe too, is that the fact that they are putting this wall up, saying we're going to do this by this date, then and like you said in New York, they're not, we're probably going to see reversals in administrations at the federal level between now and 2035, but New York is still going to be run by Democrats for the next 10 plus years, right? So that you're seeing that being.
I don't see that changing.
Yeah, right. But you do see something of an electoral reckoning happening because they hit these deadlines, and then all of a sudden it really starts to impact people.
Well, there's a very simple solution, and the Europeans are very good at it. I think every government is very good at it. You just delay. So in Europe, a lot of countries have already begun to say, okay, well, we have to ban these cars, perhaps not in 2030, perhaps in 2035. Britain is very good at it. They wanted to, Boris, when he was prime minister, he wanted to show off just how green he was, and so he brought forward the ban on ICE cars to 2030. Now the Prime Minister has said, well, we don't want to punish people, we'll do it in 2035. And there's a whole kind of controversy between the Conservatives and Labour. So the Conservatives are now saying Labour is a real problem because they want to decarbonize the national grid by 2030. That will cause blackouts and economic disaster. It's much better to do it in 2035. So what I'm expecting in Europe as a result of the elections and the shift to the right and the growing public backlash against these policies is they're not going to give up. They'll just kick it in the long grass. They will say, okay, well, perhaps we can't do it in 2035. Let's do it in 2040. And then come, 2030, they'll say, oh, let's do it in 2045. So they're not going to give up, but they can always delay it into the far future. And that's what they're very good at. And it's easy to solve a political problem.
One of the main ways that we hide the costs of, our emissions policies here in the U.S. is through subsidies. So we basically shift the cost of transition, onto government balance sheets, right? And I remember in Germany recently that they've had a big problem with doing that because of the way their laws are structured. And maybe talk a little bit about that, and also about what's been going on in the UK with these, the scandal about the contract for differences and wind power, and just I guess some of the challenges that are being faced by Europeans kind of running up against the limits of just how much they can shift onto their government balance sheets. Because I think that's probably where in the U.S. things are going to hit the fan is when we start to run into major deficits at the state and federal level because of these policies. We haven't hit that point yet, but there's been a little bit of that happening in Europe. Right.
Well, in Europe, the subsidies are not being paid by governments. They're being paid by bill payers. So the subsidies are being put onto energy bills rather than through taxation. So it doesn't add to the debt level. It adds to the debt level of households and businesses, but not to the debt.
So that's a key difference between how it's being applied here and there. Yeah. So explain that a little bit, I guess, maybe explain how that works. You're talking about how it shifts, the costs are being shifted to, put on ratepayers in a certain way. How does that happen exactly?
Well, it's simple that these subsidies are being paid by your household electricity bill. It's just put on top of the ordinary electric. It doesn't show up as you have to pay 10% or 15% for the wind farms and the solar farms. But that's how governments can avoid putting it through a budget. It's just paid directly by consumers, directly. And that, of course, causes problems because energy bills are going up quite dramatically. They are currently about twice as of what they were before the war in the Ukraine started, despite gas prices coming down to where they were before the war. So they will remain high. They are going up, and households are struggling to keep their homes warm in the winter. But companies, industries have to be now subsidized because they cannot compete internationally because of the high energy prices. So hundreds of billions are being paid to private companies just to stay in Europe. Many can't even, with subsidies, stay in Europe because they are no longer competitive. One of the biggest threats to Europe, apart from these high energy prices, which make a lot of industries uncompetitive, is, of course, that the Chinese, who have very low energy prices because they're using coal primarily, produce, solar panels and EVs for, 30-40% less than a European company, and they are now flooding Europe with their cheap products. So they've completely destroyed the solar industry in Europe. Completely, it's basically gone. And now the Europeans fear they will do the same with the European car industry, because there are basically tens of thousands of Chinese cars parked around Europe in the ports, where they have now flooded the European ports. They're all there waiting to be sold to European buyers. And they're much cheaper, and I'm told they're even better, apparently, than European EVs. So the Europeans have they are now putting tariffs on Chinese EVs, but of course the Chinese will put tariffs on European products. So there will be trade war, and it's a big headache because it might decimate European car industry.
Yeah, and of course we see the same thing happening here with the now the recent fuel economy regulations from the Biden administration, combined with the now tariffs on incoming tariffs on Chinese vehicles, and again it's almost as if the goal is not to get us to drive EVs, but to get us to stop driving entirely. And you look at every net zero plan model that's out there, and they all assume that we're going to be driving less in 2050 than we are now. And I mean that globally. When you think about the developing world, No one's going to be driving less in the developing world. I can assure you that. And even here, we drive more now than we did 20 years ago. So it's patently absurd to think that this is actually going to happen. You mentioned a good point that how the shifting onto energy bills. There are states that do that directly here in the U.S., California being one of them, that has started to roll back their policies to basically, they call it net metering, where you basically, the person that owns a solar panel on their home gets paid retail price for that panel, even for that electricity, even though it's not actually worth that much to the system. So it's a subsidy. And the challenge is that, again, what's happening here is energy scarcity is being created because as prices go up, and that's what you were describing, as prices go up, who ends up, we don't have outages per se, but who gets hurt the most? The poor who can't afford their energy bills, and then also industry. And so I think I just wanted to highlight that, because that's the risk that we have here in Texas and even in red states that are not actively pursuing net zero, is that these policies can drive up our costs to the point that even if we don't have outages, we have, the poor experience outages because they can't afford their bills, and industry leaves. And I think that's something that's really key to highlight, that that's happening in Europe already, and we have to be cognizant of that. Francis, I wanted to ask you too, what, as you talked about how New York and California are pushing full steam ahead on some of these policies, we do see some people like Ruth Teixeira. I've seen some other, commentary recently from left-leaning folks about like sounding the alarm, like, okay, this is, these policies are going to erode the Democratic coalition in the U.S. that historically has been between, the progressives and then the working class. And the progressives have won out in terms of policy positions, and now that's where the Democratic Party exists. So how do you, but yet in so many of these places like New York, there's a lot of people that are moderate and conservative too. They're not just entirely, a lot of people like yourself, right? And it's not everyone from New York is a progressive liberal, right? So how do you see this? How is it that we can somehow turn the tide in some of these states and actually get some, retreat towards reality? Even if we can't reverse things entirely. And what do you think is the kind of the coalition building that needs to happen to kind of push back against the progressive left on some of these policies?
Well, I'm going to repeat a point that I made the last time you asked me a question, which is that I don't really think that the progressives and the climate activists can be talked out of their policies by reason, or even by the example of other places like Europe. Pocketbook, I'm going to give you an example of an interesting one that just happened in New York. There's been a proposal for a long time, it's been in the works for at least 5 years, to impose what's called congestion pricing in Manhattan. That is to the benefit of the MTA, the transit system, and the plan is to impose a $15 entry fee into Manhattan. So the tolls, Manhattan is an island, of course, so you got to go over a bridge somewhere to get in, and the tolls are already in the range of $5 or $6 or $7. Well, add 15 more to that for every time you want to come in. That's been in the works for like 5 years, and it was scheduled to take effect on July 1, so just a couple of weeks from now. And 2 or 3 days ago, the governor pulled the plug and said we're going to delay it indefinitely. Now then, it came with no warning. Nobody knew where it came from. But then there's been reporting on what is the political coalition that came together on this. Well, it turns out that the main elements of the coalition were outer borough political representatives, like people from Staten Island and Queens, who would have to pay every time, and the teachers union. Who would ever have guessed that? Now, why the teachers union? Because a lot of teachers work in Manhattan in places that are not convenient to where the transit system goes, and they drive in every day. So all of a sudden, this one was hitting the pocketbook of the teachers union and some of the other city unions, actually police and fire. Again, they're scattered all around. They're not like the office buildings are near the train stations, but the police stations and the schools are scattered all around. So suddenly there was a very unexpected coalition entirely based on pocketbooks. So that's a possibility, but I come back to New York is not going to be reasoned out of the deadlines that it has imposed. They are going to be moving forward with a mandate to electrify your heat. And by the way, that's not just a new building. You have to get rid of your perfectly functioning furnace that you might have put in 2 years ago and put in an electric heat system if you're a building of a certain size, which we have a lot of. Or the electric car mandate, which starts kicking in 2026 at 35% of all vehicle sales. Current level is 8%. So supposedly in a year and a half, that's going to go to 35% by government mandate. And we're simultaneously going to be closing power plants. So something is going to break here. It's more likely to break economically than by reasoning. Than by argument.
Yeah. Well, then I guess that just means I just need to quit my job for 5 years and come back and see what happens.
Well, all of us. What are we doing? We're here to say, I told you so. What happens?
Yeah. My hope, though, is that, here in Texas and elsewhere where, we're not embracing net zero, that we can learn from this and try to stem some of the damage before we incur it upon ourselves. And so I guess that's what I see my job as doing, is trying to get to a point where we can, get people to see far enough ahead that the damage is coming and try and mitigate it a little bit if we can't completely stop it. And that kind of brings me to my next question, which is that, we see one phenomenon we're seeing in the U.S. is that that there are Republican politicians that are trying to kowtow. I don't want to single out the Democrats just alone. There are Republican politicians that are trying to kowtow to the climate change lobby. There's a bill moving through Congress right now called the Prove It Act that is effectively laying the ground for a carbon tax on imports, which Europe already has, my understanding, right? The EU already has that. So, Benny, I guess I'll ask you first. What can politicians here learn from what's happened in the UK and Europe, and why is it a bad idea to kind of endorse climate change light policies from both a policy perspective and also an electoral perspective for these politicians?
There are two things I think will focus policymakers' minds in the US and in Europe. The first is there's a clear shift in public opinion on the policies, and particularly on the cost issue. In all likelihood, once one government, one country starts rolling back, and quite a number have started rolling back. For instance, in Holland, there's a new government. They've just abandoned the kind of electric heating mandate. So this is now entirely voluntary. You want an electric heating system in your house, buy it, build it, put it in, but no one will force you to do it. So once governments start to roll back, others will follow. That's normally what happens, because they say, oh, the Germans are doing this, and the Dutch are doing this, the Italians are doing this. There must be a reason why they are doing this, so perhaps we should do this as well. This is how the green agenda evolved in the first place. The second is there's a growing realization that the whole net zero agenda is suicidal economically and industrially in the absence of a global agreement to do the same thing. So all that is happening is that the whole so-called decarbonization is only happening in Europe and in Western countries. In most nations around the world, it's not happening. The opposite is happening. They are carbonizing as much as they can. They're getting as much oil, gas, and coal out of the ground as they can. Africa is now looking to extract a lot of oil and gas and possibly coal. They are rolling back all the kind of pledges they've made. So in the absence of a global policy to decarbonize, it makes no sense to do this unilaterally. And what is worse, countries around the world are looking at what's happening in Europe and what's happening in the US and saying, we're not going to do the same thing. We're not shooting ourselves in the foot. So there is a problem, and this has always been a problem, that unless you have global agreement and which is binding for everyone, it does not make sense to do it on your own, because it has no effect whatsoever on emissions. All we've done in Europe is shift heavy industry to Asia, to other countries, thereby reducing, industrial CO2 emissions at home, but not reducing it globally, because we've only shifted it to other parts of the world, and now we're importing the products that we're no longer producing from these countries. So the reality is there hasn't really been any decarbonization in that respect, because CO2 emissions have been growing steadily over the last, ever since the whole climate agenda began. There is a realization that if you do it on your own, all you're doing is damaging your own economy and damaging your own industry. And there is no real benefit. Even when if you're concerned about CO2 emissions, hasn't made any difference whatsoever.
Yeah, and I always point out that Texas, because of how much wind and solar we have, has gone as far as any state in terms of decarbonizing our grid. I mean, the irony of New York, for example, is they have almost no wind and solar in New York because it's almost impossible to build it there unless it's offshore, which is then ungodly expensive. So even as we've done that, we emit about 200 million tons of CO2 a year from our grid in Texas, and we're the largest. I mean, we consume more than 10% of the U.S.'s electricity. Well, emissions in Asia every year are rising at more than twice that rate. So it's, even if you were to zero out our emissions from Texas, the increases every year coming from Asia will outpace that. Just on its own. And Africa is going to be following shortly behind. And we hope so, because Africa needs that energy so bad. So I always say the best thing that we can do here is to develop, truly cheap and effective zero low carbon technologies that we export to the rest of the world. And to do that requires wealth and a stable electric grid. So, it's the irony is that if we follow the path of Europe and deindustrialize, then what's ultimately going to happen is we're going to rid ourselves and the world of the ability to research new technologies that might actually reduce emissions instead of just shifting emissions to somewhere else. I guess I'll go with a couple more questions and then we'll turn to the audience here. But we've talked a little bit about kind of what makes y'all hopeful, but just describe a little bit more about what some reasons for hope that you have, and beyond just the fact that energy, economics and physics always wins, right? I think one reason I have hope is that fundamentally the net zero agenda is built on reducing energy consumption, degrowth, right? That's really what it all boils down to, because there's no other way to achieve it other than to just, degrowth everything, consume less energy, et cetera. Basically turn economic growth into economic shrinkage. And people aren't willing to accept that. People won't accept blackouts. People will not accept energy scarcity, generally speaking. And so what else and I think that gives me hope that eventually, it's like in the movie Idiocracy when eventually the crops fail and then they finally get with it and figure out how to get the crops back. What do you think gives you hope that we're eventually going to get to that point where, okay, people will learn and then move on, and try to get back to more sane policies?
Oh, wow. That's a tricky one, because that would require that people actually learn and that they're reasonable and that they understand what went wrong. My fear is that we might actually end up more like Argentina or Britain in the 70s, so it might get much worse before there's a complete change of policy making. I don't think, and I agree with Francis on that, that just by argument and telling people as it is and showing them the facts and the cost, that the policymakers will actually change course. I fear it will get much worse before people will say we've had enough. And you can see how worse it had to get in Argentina before someone like Milei came around and said we have to turn it completely around. And it will take a long time and will be, a very hard way to turn this around. But because the climate issue is so entrenched, and it is like a secular religion, it is very difficult. It's a bit like Marxism, and you know how long it took for that to disintegrate. It took almost 3 or 4 generations. I hope we won't have to wait that long. But that is my current reading, that it will get much worse before it gets better.
I love that you are hoping for hope. I think it's a wonderful thing, and I'm hoping for hope. But I am of the view that the best hope is for some guinea pig to crash disastrously as a lesson for everybody else. That's a sad thing to say. I live in the state that is most likely to be the crash dummy for this. I welcome it. I'm here every day. I'm out there telling anybody who will listen, here's why it can't possibly work. All you need to do is some simple arithmetic, and you can see that it can't possibly work. Physics and economics are going to win. But as you know, we get very little attention, and particularly we get zero attention from the left, other than attention to suppress us. You may have seen that Roger Pielke Jr. has a piece suppressed on actually the subject of climate policy, suppressed on Facebook this morning. If you try to link it, they will give you a message saying you have violated our community policy, and there are a number of people up showing that has happened. So
and this is a piece based on a journal paper published in one of Nature's journals. Yeah, so it's not like, and this is not something that is just quack job. It's published in a pretty prestigious journal.
But, and I'm sorry, I think I somewhat disagree with my colleague Benny on this, but I think that a good crash somewhere, hopefully not somewhere too big and hopefully not too many deaths, is what'll really do it. That'll turn it around.
Yeah, and I think one of the keys, and something that we're working hard on at Life Powered is trying to educate young people, more. So we've done a lot of work. We have an education director, Courtney Bagley, who has done a lot of work to start changing the science curricula in Texas. And we've had a lot of success with our current State Board of Education changing the science curricula. And I think that other states are starting to pick that up too, to put real, energy sanity into science curricula, to get continuing technical education into schools so that people can experience energy jobs. Which is, for Texas is critically important that we have a workforce. So I think that's one area where I do see hope, is that, just as the climate cult has played the long game on this, so too can the sanity cult that we have, play the long game and start to reverse this thing. Like you said, it's going to take a long time, but I can see glimmers of that coming together.
Well, one very hopeful news out of Europe is actually the voting results among the 30 and below voters, the first-time voters, the young voters. They've all basically, in most of the big European countries, are moving away from voting for the Green parties and moving more to let's say, economically reasonable parties. So that is a big move. That is a first, where the first-time voters and voters, younger than 30, are actually also shifting from the more kind of woke type of voting to the more center-right and populist right voting. That's a very interesting development in Europe.
Yeah, and I think we're going to see some of that here too in this next election, if I had to guess. Well, that is the end of my questions. We have about 20 minutes left, so if y'all, the audience here, or we could also have questions submitted online, I believe. If y'all want to pose questions for the panel, this is your time to do it.
Hello. I was wondering what you think the impact of these reversals will have on the UN. Are they going to keep doing their annual hand-wringing? Are they going to reverse course, or are they going to just keep on?
You mean the IPCC or the UN General Assembly? Pardon? Oh, COP and so on. Oh, that will go on forever. That's the kind of, the annual Christmas holiday for the Green Blob. They'll go on for the next 500 years, I'm pretty sure. Doesn't matter. They'll find something else to worry about eventually.
Well, one other thing on the UN, from the General Assembly's point of view, the purpose behind the climate agenda is to get handouts from the rich countries to the poor countries. That's not going to go away, right? The $100 billion a year climate damages fund, maybe that'll become $200 or $500 billion a year. That's not going away.
I think what can change is that as we, if we can truly get the developing world into the developed world, if Africa and South America and places that are currently asking for these handouts, if those countries can change and become wealthier, then I think it will change the dynamic of these these international bodies, and they will have a voice now that is not one of give us money, but of no, we're participants, we're equals, and therefore we don't need handouts. And if they can be the guinea pigs for reminding us, because it's been so long since we industrialized, of reminding us how that's done and how that's done through energy, then I think that can change things. I don't see the change coming from the West. I see it coming from the developed world. And I've met with people recently who are from Africa that are kind of speaking to that. So that's where I think, the annual gatherings and stuff are not gonna, those little parties are never gonna go away. Like Benny said, the climate change goes away, they'll find something else to go have a conference on. But I think the dynamics of the UN can change over time. If the developing countries can have a say in it.
Willkommen in den USA, Herr Peiser. Texas is on track to surpass California in solar power production creation this year, with Texas installing more solar capacity than any other U.S. state in 2023. Should solar panel production continue to be focused on as a means to grow Texas's grid, or should Texas pursue other cleaner energy production methods from sources such as natural gas, geothermal, or nuclear power, or go back to more traditional methods? Thank you.
You're asking this for me almost. I'll turn this a little bit to more of the panel, and then I'll give my answer to that question. But what can Texas learn from the attempts of other countries, particularly Germany, I think, in terms of subsidizing solar production and how that's become such a weight around Germany's neck, right?
Well, the first thing for policymakers who are still wanting to decarbonize is to realize that there are much more cost-efficient ways to do it. There is a beginning of realization that renewables are much more expensive than the green lobby have been telling the governments. Wind is none of the renewables in Europe, at least, are viable without handouts, without subsidies. No one is going to build a solar farm or wind farm without subsidies. It's far too expensive. So my reading of the situation in Europe is that there will be a revival of nuclear energy in a big way, and a combination of renewable and natural gas could actually achieve long-term decarbonization, possibly not with the kind of short-term targets, but in the long term, that is a path to a, clean, low-carbon national grid, if you want to go down that route. And I guess a growing number of countries will focus more on nuclear rather than renewables, because the kind of unintended consequences and unintended costs of renewables are becoming manifest. With regard to Germany, well, Germany is going back to coal. So they thought they could power the country on solar and wind and with Russian gas, and well, there was a problem apparently, and so they are reviving coal, and they're sitting on a lot, another 100-200 years of coal. It's the dirtiest form of coal, lignite, but that's what they're burning, and they will be burning it as long as they need to have electricity. So that's what happens if you have utopian energy policies.
Can I offer my advice to Texas?
Sure.
I think of Texans as being the more or most rational people in this country, but there is nothing rational about building all of this solar. So it doesn't matter how much of it you build. You could build another 100 times as much or 1,000. You're never going to get any electricity out of it at night. And it doesn't matter how many wind turbines you build. If it's calm, you're never going to get any electricity. So if you build all the solar panels in the world and all the wind turbines in the world, how much of the natural gas can you get rid of? The answer is zero. You need natural gas to supply 100% of your peak load, no matter how much solar and wind you build, to guard against a calm night. So therefore, you are going down a road of having two parallel capital investments to provide the same electricity. There is no possible way that you can double your capital investment to provide the same electricity without greatly increasing your cost of power. It doesn't make any sense.
Now, I'll add a little more to that and say that, the amount of energy storage that's required for wind and solar and batteries to replace what we call baseload power plants, those that run 24/7, is 1,000 times greater than what we have installed today. Even as we're installing quite a bit of batteries nowadays. And so I think that's the fundamental issue, is that we're never going to achieve that level of scale and we don't want to, frankly, because of the costs and the land use implications and all the other things. And the challenge is that because the variability of wind and solar makes them fundamentally hostile, those resources are fundamentally hostile to baseload power. We had, just in Texas in March, we had our net load, which is our demand minus wind and solar output, was so low that we had very few power plants running. In California, they have net load is negative now during the day when the sun's shining. So they have to export power and then rely on other entities, on other states to give them power at night. So it's, again, if you're never, what Francis is saying is right, is that you're never going to get away from the need to have backup power, because it would take far too many batteries to get rid of those backup power sources. So ultimately, what we're moving toward in Texas is toward a grid that has wind and solar and some energy storage, but then a lot of natural gas backup that's subservient, essentially. It is following the wind and solar output, right? And we're actually not going to get very much more emissions reductions than what we have already achieved because of that. If we really wanted to get the most decarbonized grid that we could get with current technology, then what you would want to have is as much nuclear as possible running 24/7, and then a little bit of wind and solar energy storage and gas on top of that to try and meet changes in load. But our system makes that impossible because we're building so much wind and solar that eats into any kind of baseload power. We're never going to see that kind of grid get built in Texas, and ultimately it's actually going to diminish our ability to reduce emissions beyond a certain point, because we just fundamentally can't have baseload nuclear or combined cycle gas being built.
Okay, I guess I would ask, do you think the goal of this so-called net zero is really to reduce emissions, or is it to enforce energy scarcity and government control of energy and transportation? Because it seems like so much of what's going on does nothing to reduce GHG emissions.
Well, it's a good question. I think regardless of what is the real rationale behind net zero, clearly if you have a net zero target, then you have to basically control everything, the whole economy, what you eat, what you drive, where you go on holiday. You have to. If you have these targets and you have to adhere to the targets, governments essentially, we have to have a command and control economy. I think the fatal flaw in the net zero agenda, as I mentioned before, is that it's only being adopted by a very few Western countries. The Indians, for instance, they're saying, we'll also adopt net zero by 2070, but we need about $1 trillion per year from the West to achieve. You want us to decarbonize? We're happy to do so. We just need a check. And rightly so. Why should a poor country like India adopt policies that makes them much poorer? So net zero with these kind of radical targets that we have in Europe requires governments to become authoritarian and a command and control economy where everything that is being done and everything we do has an energy footprint will have to be controlled and curtailed. And that's the situation we're in. That's exactly the situation we're in.
I'll go ahead, Francis.
I'll just throw in, the green blob it does not just have one mind, right? So there are different people over there. There definitely are people who may be some of the strongest advocates for extreme decarbonization policies who 100% want to see degrowth and restrictions on consumption and restrictions on freedom. And there are others who haven't thought it through and just think they're trying to be good people, just trying to save the planet. So I think the collection of people that are pushing these policies in the aggregate have different agendas. There definitely are some, probably not a majority, who have the agenda you're talking about. The trouble is that they are the most loudest, the most vociferous, and the most demanding.
And I would also say the most likely to take positions in government bureaucracies, because that's the natural. If you have that mindset, then that's naturally where you're going to go.
Get a job at the EPA.
Right, exactly. I mean, I think that's the danger. The biggest danger we face here in the U.S. is that Congress does not exercise enough of its authority over our administrative agencies, and lets them do whatever they want. And even as we, occasionally we'll get presidents who roll back some of what is done by the agencies, the ratchet only goes up over time. You know, something gets added, a little bit of it gets rolled back, more gets added. That's what we've seen over the last 2 to 3 decades, right, since the Clean Air Act amendments in 1992. So that's So I think the key is that our elected officials who are responsive to everyone, including the folks that are on the left who are not, are following along because they think they're doing the right thing. And once they see that they're not doing the right thing, that this is harmful, then that needs to translate into what politicians, our elected officials, do in terms of pushing back against the kind of devoted Marxists and government control advocates that exist primarily within the NGO space and our government agencies, right? So I think that's what has to happen, is that kind of coalition. You saw it. I mean, Francis mentioned back, what happened with this congestion price in New York. You kind of see that happening sometimes, right? And we just need more of that to happen. We have to give some room for the more sane people on the left to come over and say, yeah, we're not gonna go this far. This is absurd. We see that with the some of the rollbacks of, and I think this is happening in the UK too. There's some kind of pushbacks particularly against like the appliance regulations, right? Saying, okay, you can't buy gas stoves or gas heaters anymore. It seems like there's a real pushback against like that, saying, okay, people are like, no, this is going too far, basically.
Well, there is an interesting development within the Labour Party in Britain. And that has to do with the kind of limited amount of money they will have when they win. And it's clear that Labour will win the coming elections and they will form the next government. And what is happening is that among their MPs and among their main voters, there is a clear divide about what do we want to prioritize with the little money that we might have to invest, to spend. And there is, of course, a strong green faction within Labour, but there is also a kind of more trade unionist, traditional group of MPs who are saying, why are we spending all these billions on wind farms when we have to look at, national health, education, infrastructure, and so on. So there is actually, when the money runs out and you have to actually prioritize your policies, there is actually a divide about these issues. And the Labour leadership, who pledged to spend 28 billion every year on net zero, has already U-turned on that and said, we might not have enough money to do that, and there are other priorities. So I wouldn't be surprised if even among the kind of mainstream left parties, there's a growing realization. Take electric vehicles. I mean, most people in Britain who drive electric vehicles are conservatives, are people who are, can afford an EV or have a house where they can charge EVs. Think about a Labour government demanding that everyone has to drive an EV. It would alienate most of their own voters. So some of are the same with gas heating, telling them that they have to replace a gas boiler for something that is 4 times as expensive. These are regressive policies that don't actually make a lot of sense for left-wing parties. So there is in my view, a chance that there will be a split among mainstream, you call them liberal, we call them left parties, on this issue, because it actually hurts their voters most.
Now, I think that's a good ending point, and we are up on the hour here. Going back to my question of where can we see seeds of hope? That that's what we're looking for here, right? We're trying to be happy warriors here at the foundation. I think where we see it is that, again, there even among the coalitions that form the left leaning parties within our respective countries, that I'm going to see this. We're going to see this in the Texas Senate tomorrow. They're going to have hearings on the grid tomorrow in the Texas Senate. That even the left-leaning politicians are still very attuned to the fact that their primary voter base will not accept regressive policies. And as those costs are made known, and I think it's incumbent upon us who understand these things to make the cost clear, make the cost of these policies clear. Don't let them be hidden. That then that will translate into voter backlash, and ultimately the coalitions that are needed to enact these kind of policies will dissolve because of that. So I think that's where we have hope. That's where we need to keep driving forward. Again, raising the IQ of people, raising the energy IQ of people, so that we can kind of break apart the coalitions that are needed to pass these destructive policies and replace them with coalitions that can form constructive policies. So with that, I'll thank our speakers. Thanks again for traveling all the way here, and we're happy to have you.